Now, agri-food economist and former chairman of Meat Industry Ireland, Ciaran Fitzgerald, is here with us to discuss exactly that. Ciaran, where will that 250,000 tonnes of Irish beef go after Brexit?
Well, I think there's a huge difficulty in terms of looking at alternative markets. I mean, there are obvious markets. When you look at where we currently export, as you say, there's 250,000 tonnes goes to the UK. There's about another 200,000 tonnes goes to the rest of Europe, and then there's about 50,000 tonnes going worldwide. If you go back 20 years ago, we would have exported an awful lot of beef to North Africa and the Middle East. And there are markets that will take beef, but the real issue is at what price will that return? And therefore, to be honest with you, what's really needed is a transitional arrangement above and beyond the EU-UK exit strategy. There needs to be a sort of a market transitional arrangement that looks at the fact that the way this whole thing is evolving, where you could have a no-deal Brexit and the UK has tariff barriers, that rather than suddenly the shutters come down and you have to find a market for half the beef you produce, there needs to be EU supports put in place that deal with orderly marketing, that create a situation where over a 5 to 10 year period, if the UK is now going to be a market that returns way less than it did consistently, that you're given time to find new markets, because you can't, other than by dumping product, you cannot find new markets in 2 and 3 years of a scale that we're talking about here. So from a European perspective, they don't want the rest of the EU, which is a surplus beef area, to have to absorb 200,000 tonnes of Irish beef. That'll bring down the price of beef right across Europe. Nobody in Europe really wants that. And a lot of the markets that we have access to in third countries and even new markets like China, yes, in 10 years' time will take significant quantities, but they won't take it overnight, either in volume terms and certainly not in price. So there needs to be a mix of what is actually happening, whereby there's a lot of investment in new markets, which in the case of international markets has a major part played by the government in terms of the minister and that whole I suppose relationship piece, whereby you open up a market at a state to state level, they become more comfortable with the veterinary standards, etc., and there's markets and promotion. But the pace at which that can happen is not going to absorb the quantities we're talking about here in 5 years, never mind in a year overnight. So my sense of this is that if you go back about 5 years ago, the Russian market closed for European products. And that was a huge knock right across commodity markets, particularly in dairy and pork, for instance. We had some impact on the beef side. Now, what the European Union did was they introduced a fund. It was under the commissionership of Phil Hogan at the time. That introduced a number of market supports. And that fund, I think it was 600 million euros, was based on support for those countries most affected by the impact on trade. So in the case of Russia, when they stopped importing European product, it was Finland and Latvia and Estonia, the 3 Baltic states, got a big share of the supports, because they, on a trade-weighted basis, they had traded most with Russia, and then everybody else got something on that basis. That's what's needed here in the sort of short to medium term, and I'm talking about short to medium term. In the next 6 months, we need to see a construct around, well, there are discussions going on, and everybody is, if you like, between the UK and the EU, sticking to their official policies on what is needed for the UK to leave in an orderly fashion, what the UK seems to want, this sort of, well, we live by WTO rules. In the midst of that, there are farmers with cattle to finish, there are livelihoods to be maintained. What's needed is a market transition scheme, very much based, I think, on the Russian model of 5 or 6 years ago, that says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to support the incomes of producers, and we're going to support orderly marketing. And I think that there are a number of ways in which that can be done in terms of income support.
Is that kind of the most realistic option in terms of holding and maintaining what we have, the market share we have at the moment? Is that a more realistic option than opting for diversifying markets as well in those other regions, such as the Middle East, China, Japan, Southeast Asia?
Yeah, absolutely, because the British market is the highest paying beef market in the world. Okay, so, if you look at the markets in North Africa and the Middle East that we used to serve, they're now served by Brazil. So the cattle price in Brazil ranges from €2.50 to €2.80. Now, when we sold product into the Middle East, there was about €1 of an export subsidy on those products. Export subsidies are not going to be reintroduced. So, to be blunt, you can't produce cattle in Ireland and at sort of €2.50 into it, so therefore either the market price in those countries is going to have to rise significantly, which is not going to happen, they can't afford it, or the European Union gives you €1.50 in export subsidy. They won't do that. What they could do, and which would enable us, I think, to transition to a weaker UK market and also facilitate a longer term development of other markets, is to provide income supports. Like, there is a quantifiable amount that comes every year to Ireland in forms of direct payments. Of the 1.3 billion, I think about 850 million of that goes to the beef sector. That amount needs to be increased as part of this market transition. So that's one of the suggestions I think that needs to be looked at, is there needs to be an income support system put in place. You can't just invent a system where there hasn't been anything previously. So therefore, there's a good precedent and there's plenty of information in terms of where the direct payments are going currently. They need to be increased to reflect the price impact of either WTO tariffs into the UK, or whatever price impact we get from the fact that the negotiations are either going slowly or badly, or there's going to be more sterling weakness. I think that's a far better, a more practical way of dealing with this major dislocation in the markets than trying to pretend that there are markets out there that will take the beef and that will return a price. They just won't do both. They may take the beef, but they won't return an economic price.
And at the same time, Ciaran, the agri-industry in Ireland is beefing up, I suppose, their prospects in the UK. Recently, there has been a lot of acquisitions and developments in the UK to mitigate or to limit damage post-Brexit. So you have recently Kepac acquiring the Two Sisters, ABP and the development of their plant in Scotland, and Dawn Meats and Dumbia on their joint venture. What kind of message is that sending to Irish beef farmers? What kind of message do you think that they're getting from those types of acquisitions happening, where they're really looking to sustain what they have over there and potentially opt for the English beef market instead?
Well, I think it's a very pragmatic message, to be honest with you. I mean, all of those investments are about sustaining a business that has been built on supplying the UK retail chain. So what the companies are doing is reinforcing that business against the threat that their ability to supply from the Irish side is going to be under threat. It wouldn't make any sense, and in fact it would lead to a lesser return for Ireland Inc. if you were to ignore opportunities to strengthen your access. I mean, what those businesses are based on is partnership with the customer. So if the customer has an option to either for you to buy more resources in the UK, for instance, or to go with somebody else, then I think from a practical perspective, but also from an Irish beef industry perspective, it's far better that growth is being taken up on the Irish side. I mean, the other part of all this, though, is that, when you look at what the UK is going to do into the future, the UK needs to import 400,000 tonnes of beef every year. That's the base. They don't produce all the beef they consume themselves. And there are questions then of where does that come from if Irish beef is priced out of the market or European beef is priced out of the market. We're looking at situations where that beef can come from Brazil, etc., etc. So I think there's a far better prospect of having a reasonable or a more reasonable in a situation where we're dealing with a major change and major market fracture. If you like, marketing arrangement around Irish beef, where Irish beef companies into the UK have strengthened their position. If we become just a marginal supplier, then we'll be dismissed on price and access over time. So there's a degree of pragmatism here. But if you go back to the overall challenge here is a European Union policy one, to be honest with you. Yes, there's the UK-EU discussions, but while that's going on, what the European Union needs to do is to come up with a market transition project, as I've described, that deals with the fact that there's a market shock and make sure. I think ultimately this is where I would see the kernel of this. The UK has unilaterally voted to leave the European Union. There was a lot of talk at the time that said we can't have a situation, we Europeans, where the UK benefits from exit of the European Union. Whatever about that, what we certainly can't have is a situation where Irish farmers and the Irish food industry is worse off because the UK decided to leave the European Union. That's not in the interests, clearly, of the Irish farmer and the Irish food industry, but it's certainly not in the interests of the European Union that the consequence of one large country with a large market exiting is that a smaller country becomes disadvantaged. So, I think there has to be much more focus at European level on ways in which you deal with practical ways of ensuring incomes to beef farmers are compensated in terms of this market dislocation. And as I said, there's a measurable amount every year that comes in direct payments. There are ways in which you can calculate the price impacts if there are and say, well, right, we're going to increase those direct payments by a third or whatever. There's even the possibility, if you were to look at it in a bit more detail, of introducing a slaughter premium over a period of time, even for 5 years, so that cattle that are slaughtered here in a situation where, suddenly there are WTO tariffs come into the UK, which would amount to a catastrophic amount. You're talking about 70 to 80% of the average beef price, but in terms of 4 quarter cuts, most of the tariff would be greater than the price. But hopefully things won't be as dramatic as that. But in any and all situations, there are ways in which the European Union can deal with the challenge of making sure that the Irish beef farmer and the Irish food industry isn't worse off because our neighbour decided to leave the European Union by means of increased income supports or a slaughter premium or whatever the transitional best transitional supports for the beef industry can be.
And Ciaran, you've noted before that UK retailers, since the BSE crisis back in the 1990s, have actually, in some ways, demanded higher standards on food than the EU. And there are lots of concerns about a cheap food policy in the UK post-Brexit. Can you really imagine a complete turnaround on that type of scenario?
Well, it wouldn't be consistent, but I suppose if you look to the point that I have made previously, that a lot of the standards around the production of beef and some of the standards, evolving standards like things like animal welfare, et cetera, have been driven by the retailer saying, well, we're getting messages from our consumers. They're concerned about these things. They're concerned about climate change. All of that has led to a situation where, from an Irish beef producing perspective, we would argue there are costs that we incur in terms of serving that UK market, which aren't the sort of input costs that we normally describe, but they are about serving a high quality market. Now, if the UK supermarkets were to decide, well, the last 10 years has been a sort of, it is what it is, but we can get very cheap beef in Brazil. We don't care about the rainforest coming down. We don't care about the fact that it seems there are irregularities in meat inspection over there every year or two, and we're going to just make sure it's cheap. That would be very dramatic, and I don't think the UK consumer would be thrilled. I think there is another challenge, though, which is that certainly the discounters in the UK, the Aldis and Lidls, have prioritised UK origin beef, and they have also prioritised a low-cost model, and are saying, well, you know, whatever is going to happen, we'll sell more UK beef, but we won't see price inflation. I'd be concerned about that, because I think the reality is if sterling weakens again, and if we are looking at a situation where there are even small trade charges introduced, the price of beef in the UK needs to increase for us to be able to sell at a normal level. And in the natural scheme of things, that should happen when beef becomes harder to produce and more costly. My concern is that the discounters have a no inflation policy, and that the big four, the Asda, Sainsbury's, which could be one retailer by the time these things go through next year, and Tesco and others will say, well, we're not going to do beef inflation either. In that situation, too, we need to look at ways in which there are income responsive measures introduced by the European Union. And I think I really do go back to that being the core response here. You go back to the original question, Claire, and the point that's made in the VTR. Like, you cannot take a situation that has evolved over whatever hundreds of years, but certainly in the last 20 years, whereby we export 50% of our beef to our nearest neighbour, a neighbour that has 65 million people, whereas we only have 5 million. Our beef is largely fresh, which means it has a premium. The logistics of getting fresh beef to the rest of Europe, never mind to the world, are very expensive, and in reality a lot of beef would have to be frozen, which immediately hits its price. So all of that can't be just expected to be accommodated by the Irish beef farmer and the Irish food industry. That needs to be accommodated by transition arrangements. And if you go back to the time that we joined the European Union in the 1970s, and ourselves, the UK and Denmark, you had 8 years of a transition arrangement when you were entering the EU. You had price barometers, and you had price adjustments that took place for those 8 years on the basis that you were coming into a different market. Again, this needs to be reflected in terms of a transitional market support policy for the Irish beef farmer and the Irish beef industry over a period, I would say, 3 to 5 years.
Thanks very much for that, Ciaran. That's all we have time for, but lots of food for thought in your commentary.